Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing Governor Jay Inslee's push to keep the state's carbon auctions, King County approving a national high minimum wage hike for unincorporated parts of the county, fallout after a massive accounting error and tax extension refusal at a rural school district, and a look at Washington's stagnating housing market. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. On the November ballot this fall is a citizen-driven measure that would repeal Washington's Climate Commitment Act, a program that has carbon-emitting entities in the state buy the allotments at auctions. The program has raised more than $2 billion since its inception. That money goes to green initiatives like electrification. But a downside is that it's broadly seen as responsible for gas prices rising as high as 50 cents per gallon above the normal otherwise seen rate. Facing the possible loss of one of his crowning achievements, the lame duck governor is back on the campaign trail. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell covered Inslee's news conference. TJ, what stood out to you?
What stood out to me most was how Inslee avoided using the word carbon emissions. That phrase did not come out of his mouth the entire press conference, unless I missed it. But he focused very much on air pollution, reducing air pollution and air quality. And that was kind of his way of, his argument was that's the central purpose of the Climate Commitment Act when it's reducing carbon emissions. That's the central part if you read the actual law.
That is a peculiar shift in terms of marketing-wise. Do you have any idea why that might be? Do you think that's deliberate?
One, they don't have the data yet on whether it's reducing carbon. And what's interesting is I reached out to the Department of Ecology to ask them for their latest carbon emission reports for the state. And the latest data we have is from 2019. And at that point, carbon emissions were at their highest level since 2007. So instead of carbon emissions going down, they were going up. Now it's been a couple of years, but there's no way to track. There's no way, if you're trying to measure the success of it, the data isn't there yet. And that can also be the same for the air quality. Like, it's impossible for them to look at the purpose and say, we're meeting the objective. And right. What also struck me at this conference was he was talking about how much money they were spending on certain things like electrification of the transportation sector or invested in air quality sensors or things like that. Like, the focus was on how much money they're spending on certain programs.
So we really don't have a current state of Washington's pollution levels right now. And I guess to be fair, TJ, if this money is being collected, from, in the last year or so, the money then doesn't just simply, they don't throw it up into the air and it starts absorbing carbon. Right. They have to put this money into, they spend it on these programs that will, in theory, reduce carbon. That might take a while because it's a lot of, technically infrastructure.
Well, and that's the issue is that this is an interesting thing with the law compared to a lot of other laws where the benefits are immediately felt and the effects and consequences aren't felt until later. That's how a lot of legislation occurs where the public can support it. With the Climate Commitment Act, the opposite is happening. The effects, the consequences of it are being felt immediately. Any benefits are going to be long-term. And by that time, this could be the downfall of the CCA is the fact that gas prices immediately shot up when the law took effect. As far as the benefits, we're not going to know for a while. And also, how are you going to know that if carbon emissions are being reduced, is it directly tied to the CCA or is it caused by something else?
Yeah, you can't prove a correlation, right? Like one of the current things is the targets of this money is smoke from forest fires. And they've got ways to try and, mitigate forest fires and such. But that was one thing you found that, solving the smoke inhalation, hazard issue is a bit more complicated than spending money on it, right?
Yes, that's what the other thing that struck me is they were talking about how wildfire smoke was caused by climate change. Wildfire smoke is caused by a different variety of factors, one of which is actually if the fuel is moist, it's going to emit more smoke than dry fuel.
Right.
The severity of a wildfire season is also determined by a whole bunch of different things. One is that the forests haven't been actively managed until recently, and they weren't allowing prescribed burning, which allows them to get rid of the fuels that are on the forest floors and cause these very catastrophic wildfires. Another
dry timber, you're saying. I mean, you say fuels, it's dry timber.
Yeah. Another thing that a huge factor is the precipitation levels in key weeks in July and August, because if there's any kind of rain that moistens the light fuels, that can prevent wildfires from actually occurring. And so there were a couple of years where you had one year recently where it was one of the worst in state history, and then the next year was one of the mildest in a decade. So it has nothing to do with the temperature during a wildfire season or these like global climate factors. A lot of this stuff is based on whether or not you get 1 or 2 inches of rain during late July, early August.
Right. It's just about timing in that regard in terms of the, mitigating forest fire smoke and inhalation. And like you said, but the humidity of the wood being the fuel being burnt, but in terms of beyond the forest fire mitigation, which seems very, very, just complicated, give a little bit more context about where these billions of dollars are going or are intended to go from the carbon emission.
They're spending a lot of it on electrifying the transportation sector, including electrifying the state's ferry fleet, which is the largest of any state in the country.
Right. And that has led to a whole different debate about because right now the ferry fleet is short on ferries, and you've got, it's one of the most highly trafficked waterways in terms of ferry traffic, and it's created quite a divide between Governor Inslee, who says, we need to move forward with electrification of these because we've got the money from the CCA to do it. But both of at this point, the leading contenders to succeed, Inslee, have said, no, we need diesel. We need ferries operating immediately.
Right. The other thing is and I've done stories on this before, if the CCA is repealed, it's going to completely gut the spending. It's like 84% of all funding for the EV investments is coming from the CCA revenue. So that's going to cause problems because it means there's no way they're going to be able to get the infrastructure in by the time that the ban on new gasoline car sales or registration in the state takes place. So you could be forcing people to use vehicles that lack the infrastructure in order to navigate the state. And based on what I've been looking at as far as the current existing public charging ports, if you have if you have thefts at certain sections, you could completely shut down the ability of people to travel in different parts of the state.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, about how if the CCA is repealed, which at all points right now, people, like you said, hurting at the pump and saying, I don't want to have to pay for that. This is ridiculous. If it is, we've been of the mind that there might be a sort of a come to Jesus moment about whether or not being a fully electrified motor vehicle commuter fleet by 2030 or 2035 or even 2040 is realistic. So we will definitely keep track of this as the days go on, getting towards the November election. Thank you, TJ. Moving on, a school district in Moses Lake is in triage mode after not only seeing voters shoot down a renewal of a levy extension, but a massive accounting error that led to the district thinking it had millions of dollars more than they thought they did. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser is covering this ongoing saga at the Moses Lake School District. Tim, give us an overview of just how the district found themselves in this situation.
Yeah, Cole, it all started with the district's failed educational programs and operations levy. The district's current levy is set to expire at the end of the year, which is going to leave around a $4 million budget shortfall. But since that renewal failed in February and April, Moses Lake isn't going to qualify for other funding from the state, like local effort assistance funding, which is going to account for another $4.2 million shortfall. And the district's also missing out on regionalization funds for another $2 million, and then another $1.8 million due to increased enrollment. But that accounting area you mentioned is the big ticket item. After Moses Lake realized their major shortfall with the levy and the other funds, they reached out to North Central Education Services District, who went through the district's accounting and found that $11 million accounting error. And it was all because they had double booked an accrual and failed to fix it later on, leaving the district thinking that they are in a much better position than they are at now.
Yeah, you said it was like, it went from like, what, 11 million to 2 million or something, like 9 million to 2 million. I know that the final number was like, they were down to $2 million from double digit million, seven figures at that point. So this was like you said, this was a massive, massive overcount of what they thought they had. And now they're cutting teachers, right? My next question then becomes, are school closings on the horizon?
Well, right now it looks like they're just going to cut staff and other items. They haven't said anything about closing schools. Yesterday was the district's deadline for issuing those non-renewal notices to administrative staff and teachers under collective bargaining agreements, but the board didn't give a hard number on the number of positions they were going to cut. Instead, it's estimated that around 100 personnel received that notice yesterday, and the day before, saving the school around $13 million. So a significant amount of their deficit. So they're calling out
$13 million. The staff cuts won't be enough, right?
Yeah, not quite. The district still has till June 1st to let go of additional classified staff. But they also released a summary of recommended reductions that says we could see cuts to the school sports programs, other community programs, general supplies and equipment, technology upgrades, facility usage for those sports programs, and a bunch of other items too.
And now, since you wrote this earlier this week, there's been another development. We've starting to see some heads roll.
Yeah, Moses Lake isn't the only district facing cuts like this. It's going on around much of the state. On Tuesday, the Wenatchee School District announced a budget shortfall of around $9 million, and its school board voted to close one of its elementary schools and effectively cut 63 positions throughout the district. Seattle also recently voted to close 20 out of 80 of its elementary schools. Bellevue closed 2 elementary schools last year. They might close more this year. Olympia's looking at closing some of its schools. And I heard this morning that Yelm School District on the west side is looking at cutting its staffing by a third. So it looks like this problem is becoming more and more common around the state.
Right. And I mean, you can't assume a massive accounting error like you did in Moses Lake with these, but I wonder how much of this is owed to higher spending levels because of the influx of federal money in from the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent, aid bills that just saw billions and billions of dollars sent to every state and then distributed to every school district. And now, after they had beefed up programs and maybe added teachers because of this, they're now facing the reality that money was a one-time deal. And this could be the consequence of those. I know in other states we've seen that as well. And some have directly said, look, we added things that were recurring costs, thinking that we would have had revenue generation by that time, but the economic growth simply did not catch up to it, or we had kids leave and now we get lower federal funding. So it's something definitely to track on a statewide basis. And thank you for covering this so comprehensively, Tim. I appreciate it. Businesses in rural and urban areas of unincorporated King County will now pay its workers at the highest rates in the nation for minimum wage. After a contentious set of hearings, the county leaders did move forward with the measure. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauley has followed this through the process. Spencer, give us a rundown of what these new ordinance-required pay hikes will look like.
Ultimately, businesses in unincorporated King County will pay $20.29 minimum wage. The highest tier of that are companies with over 500 employees. They will be ultimately paying that minimum wage requirement starting next year. Now, since this initiative was proposed, there have been amendments to create tiers. So small businesses with 15 employees or less will start with a minimum wage of around $17 starting next year. But ultimately, it will be phased into that $20.29 minimum wage. And an employer with in between 15 employees, but fewer than 500 will start at $18.29 and will ultimately get to that $20.29 minimum wage.
When you hear, people hear unincorporated parts of a county, they tend to think rural areas because you're outside of a city limits. But in suburban areas, King County has a large suburban sprawl. These suburban areas might, have business owners that just happen to fall outside of a city's boundaries, and they'll be subject to this minimum wage hike.
Exactly. Yeah, there are some smaller towns in unincorporated King County that people probably don't even know that they're not their own, cities. There's towns like White Center, Skyway, and Vashon Island that are, they're not quite rural areas per se, but they do fall in the unincorporated King County area. So you're going to have these employees getting minimum wages there, and then ultimately employers have to start raising prices for things. One thing I've talked to before is that some people in some businesses in unincorporated King County were saying this affects us because our customers don't quite understand that we're not in certain cities. For instance, I talked to Cascadia Pizza. They have a location just outside the small city of Maple Valley. So they will fall subject to this minimum wage increase. But they say, customers will go to other pizza spots that are just down the road because they fall within Maple Valley and they're not subject to this minimum wage increase. So their prices are going to stay the same. And so that's one thing where this might negatively impact some businesses.
Yeah, right. And it becomes, like you said, it's a patchwork of different pay rates. And another thing too, I thought of earlier about when you were describing the employee counts is I've seen in other states where they will say, okay, well, a small business, we're going to let you phase this in, but only if you have fewer than 500 employees. And then they hear from a franchisee who is a single business owner, but at the same time, he or she may own a Starbucks. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, I've only got 12 employees, but certain jurisdictions will say, no, you're part of Starbucks, a massive conglomeration. You are going to be the one that takes that hit right away. And so there's so many different rules and things sometimes after these ordinances were passed that will get hashed out by governing bodies, rules committees within King County, for instance. If it's not directly stated in the ordinance that you yourself as a proprietor who might be tied to a larger company is going to be exempt from that immediate $20 and change pay increase minimum. Mm-hmm. Now, you hit on something really important too about the new ordinance putting a disparity between unincorporated areas in certain cities. The pizza owner was very clear about how this is going to put a disproportionate burden on him and his employees, and he threatened to roll back work hours. He threatened to lay off employees because we really didn't have a choice, because in the service industry, this is a very, very razor thin margin industry, correct?
Correct. Yeah. And even his employees attended some of these meetings and said, don't do this because I'm going to lose money because I'm getting less hours. And this includes tips and whatnot. So that's a lot of, there are, of course, people advocating for the minimum wage increase. But on the other hand, there's still some employees who are saying this will impact me negatively.
Was the council unanimous in approval of this ordinance?
No. There are two Republican council members, Reagan Dunn and Pete von Reichbauer, who were the only two no votes. Now, Reagan Dunn proposed two amendments to this ordinance before it was ultimately approved on Tuesday, one of which was to exclude rural areas from this minimum wage increase, but that was denied. Another was this total compensation package. Now, a ton of businesses have attended the 10 or so meetings in which this bill was briefed. Of course, businesses called for the council to not pass the ordinance altogether. But a number also kind of accepted that the way that the King County Council has proposed this and talked about it, it's looking like it was going to be approved no matter what they said. So some called for a total compensation model as part of this minimum wage increase. Now, what that means is tips, gratuities, bonuses are all counted towards the hourly minimum wage rate. And a lot of these businesses, including Cascadia Pizza, were saying this will kind of help us, give us some breathing room. And so we can give, so our employees more hours. Dunn proposed this, mentioning other cities, including Seattle, that have this in place.
Seattle does that, right?
Exactly. But King County Council denied that.
Okay. Well, we'll track that, and maybe we catch up with your pizza friend here coming up in the next couple months to see how the effects of this hit once it actually hits the reality. Thank you, Spencer. There's no denying that homes in Washington are, for a lack of better word, pricey. There are home buyers giving up on getting a new home altogether. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson spoke to the professionals who grease the skids of Washington's housing industry. Carlene, when you spoke to the head of Washington Realtors, what did he give as one of the roots of the issue of the low number of home sales in Washington state?
Well, because we all refinanced our homes during the pandemic, right? That flood of refinancing of homes is now the reason many of us are basically stuck, even if we want to move, even if there's a major life event. If you refied your home at 2.99% during the pandemic, as honestly a huge percentage of homeowners in Washington state and across the country, for that matter, did, you're now stuck. They are starving for sellers, not just here in Washington state, but across the country. But here in Washington, it's perhaps a little worse.
And well, and also too, it's not that you're stuck by your own profit. I mean, I've seen the low interest refis and people that bought homes during, 2021, 2022, when interest rates were really, really low compared to now, referred to as the golden handcuffs, because you're in a wonderful situation in terms of what you are paying in total interest compared to if you were to sell that home for a market rate right now, which is still much higher. But it's the issue then becomes you have to get a new mortgage.
I did some homework this week. I honestly just have been thinking about moving myself for the last couple of years within the same region, right? But even to right now, make a lateral move, buy a home for the same approximate value that I could sell my home for, right? Same square footage, same general area. So the comparables are fair, right? So you know how you get on and search Zillow, Redfin, whatever. They show you an estimated mortgage payment. Right now, if I could sell my home for what I believe it to be worth, move into a home in the same general area for the same general value, it's $1,000 more a month for the same home.
Yeah, and you spoke to an academic that did bring up that there is still a contingent of people that are in the market for these new homes, but it's narrow.
It is, yeah. I spoke to a gentleman by the name of Mike Wilkerson who teaches a real estate class at Portland State, and he's also works for a company called Echo Northwest. They're an economic consulting firm. So he talks to people all the time about, I want to move, but I can't move. And, he explained to me housing was traditionally a lot more affordable. The price of a home relative to what your income is, right? Today, there's all these extenuating circumstances. Not only your income hasn't risen with the price of everything else, inflation and everything else, but first-time home buyers, they're just not there right now. So you've got this giant pool of people that would be first-time home buyers. My son's almost 26. He and his girlfriend are, talking about getting married and wanting to save. They cannot possibly afford right now to save for a down payment. So you've got this giant pool of people that want to get in that can't save for it. And unless you've had a huge increase in, your income or other life event, you've gotten, got some money from a parent who's passed or whatever, people have not been able to move.
The economics of realty. Thank you, Carlene, and a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.